Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Monday, April the 21st, 2025. This conversation actually might go out tomorrow on the 22nd. Nonetheless, the headlines of the Financial Times, the world's most global economic newspaper, are miserable from an American point of view. US stocks and the dollar are sinking again as Senate Donald Trump renews his attack on the Fed chair, Jay Powell. Meanwhile, Trump is also attacking the universities and many other bastions of civilization, at least according to the FT's political columnist, Gideon Rackman. For another FT journalist, my guest today, Simon Kuper, who's been on the show many times before. All this bad news about America suggests that for Americans, it's time to move to Europe. Simon is joining us from Paris, which Paris, is that in Europe, Simon?
I was walking around today and thinking it has probably never in its history looked as good as it does now. It really is a fabulous city, especially when the sun shines.
Nicer than where I am in San Francisco?
I always used to like San Francisco, but I knew it before every house cost $15 million.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely true, but maybe there's some truth. Paris isn't exactly cheap either, is it? Certainly where you live.
Cheaper than San Francisco. So I did, for this article that you mentioned, I did some research on house prices, and certainly central Paris is one of the most expensive areas in the European Union, but still considerably cheaper than cities like New York and San Francisco. A friend of mine who lives here told me that if she moved to New York, she would move from central Paris to, for the same price, living in some very, very distant suburb of New York City.
Well, your column this week, Americans, it's time to move to Europe. You obviously wrote with a degree of relish. Is this Europe's revenge on America, that it's now time to reverse the brain drain from Europe to America? Now it's from America to Europe.
I mean, I don't see it as revenge. I mean, I'm a generally pro-American person by inclination. I even married an American and have children who are American as well as being French and British. So when I went to the US firstly as a child, age 10, 11, I was in 6th grade in California. I thought it was the most advanced, wonderful place in the world, and the sun shone, and there was nowhere nicer than California. And then I went as a student in my early 20s, and again I thought this was the early 90s. This is the country of the future. It's so much more advanced than Europe, and they have this new kind of wise technocratic government that is going to make things even better. And it was the beginning of a big American boom of the 90s, when I think American quality of life reached its peak. That life expectancy was reached, that was then declined a long time after the late 90s. So my impressions in the past were always extremely good, but no longer. The last 20 years visiting the US, I've never really felt this is a society where ordinary people can have as good a life as in Europe.
When you say ordinary people, I mean, you're not an ordinary person, and I'm guessing most of the people, you and your wife certainly isn't ordinary. She's a well-known writer. In fact, she's written on France and the United States and parenthood, very well-known. You're well-known. What do you mean by ordinary people?
Yeah, I mean, it's not entirely about me. Amazingly, I am not so egomaniac as to draw conclusions on such matters, just looking at my own situation. What I wrote about the US is that if you're in the 1% in the US and you are pursuing great wealth in finance or tech, and you have a genuine shot at it, you will achieve wealth that you can't really achieve in Europe. You know, the top end of the US is much higher than in Europe. Still, not necessarily true that your life will be better. So even rich Americans live shorter than rich Europeans. But okay, so the 1%, America really offers greater expansion opportunities than Europe does. Anywhere below that, the Europeans in the bottom 99%, let's say, they live longer than their American equivalents. They are less fat, their bodies function better because they walk more, because they're not being bombarded by processed food in the same way. Although we have political polarization here, it's not as extreme as in the US, where I quote a European friend of mine who lives in the American South. He says he sometimes doesn't go out of his house for days at a time because he says meeting Trump supporters makes him quite anxious. That
Where
might
does
be
he live? I saw that. I
Yeah,
saw that paragraph in the piece. You said he doesn't, and I'm quoting him, a European friend of mine who lives in the American South sometimes doesn't leave his house for days on end so as to avoid running into Trump supporters. Where does he live?
he lives. Let me say, he lives in Georgia. He lives in the state of Georgia.
Well, is that Atlanta? I mean, Atlanta is a large town. Lots of anti-Trump sentiment there. Whereabouts in Georgia?
He doesn't live in Atlanta, but I also don't want to specify exactly where he lives because he's entitled to some
In case he
privacy.
just started. But in all seriousness, Simon, isn't this a bit exaggerated? I mean, I'm sure there are some of your friends in Paris don't go outside the fancy center because they might run into fans of Marine Le Pen. What's the difference?
I think that polarization creates more anxiety in the US and is more strongly felt for a couple of reasons. One is that because people might be armed in America, that gives an edge to any kind of disagreement that isn't here in Europe. And secondly, because religion is more of a factor in American life, people hold their views more strongly, more fervently than here. So I think there's a seriousness and edge to the American polarization that isn't quite the same as here. And the third reason I think polarization is worse is because Trump's movement is more extreme even than European far-right movements. So my colleague John Byrne-Murdoch at the Financial Times has mapped this, that Republican views, from issues from climate to the role of the state are really off the charts. There's no European party coeval to them. So, for example, the far right party in France, the Rassemblement National, doesn't deny climate change in the way that Trump does.
So, how does that contextualize Le Pen or Meloni or even the Hungarian neo-authoritarians for whom a lot of Trump supporters went to Budapest to learn what he did in order to implement Trump 2.0?
Yeah, I think Orban, in terms of his creating an authoritarian society where the universities have been reined in, where the courts have been reined in that sense, is a model for Trump. His friendliness with Putin is more of a model for Trump. Meloni and Le Pen, although I do not support them in any way, are not quite there. And so Meloni in Italy is in a coalition and is governing as somebody who's relatively pro-European. She's pro-Ukrainian, she's pro-NATO. So although, she and Trump seem to have a good relationship, she is nowhere near as extreme as Trump. And you don't see anyone in Europe who's proposing these kinds of tariffs that Trump has. So I think that I would call it the craziness or the extremism of MAGA doesn't really have comparisons. I mean, Orban, because he leads a small country, he has to be a bit more savvy and aware of what, for example, Brussels will wear. So he pushes Brussels, but he also needs money from Brussels. So he reins himself in. Whereas with Trump, it's hard to see much restraint operating.
I wonder if you're leading American liberals on a little bit, Simon. You suggested it's time to come to Europe, but Americans in particular aren't welcome, so to speak, with open arms, certainly from where you're talking from in Paris. And I know a lot of Americans who have come to Europe, London, Paris, elsewhere, and really struggled to make friends. Would For Americans who are seriously thinking of leaving Trump's America, what kind of welcome are they going to get in Europe?
I mean, it's true that I haven't seen anti-Americanism as strong as this probably in my lifetime. It might have been like this during the Vietnam War, but I was a child, I don't remember. So there is enormous antipathy to, let's say, to Trumpism. So I had two visiting Irish people. I had lunch with them on Friday who both work in the US, and they said somebody shouted at them on the street, "Americans go home," which I'd never heard, honestly, in Paris. And they shouted back, "We're not American," which, is a defense that doesn't work if you are American. So that is not nice. But my sense of Americans who live here is that the presumption of French people is always that if you're an American who lives here, you're not a Trumpist. Just like 20 years ago, if you're an American who lives here, you're not a supporter of George W. Bush. So, there is a great amount of awareness that there are Americans and Americans. Actually, the most critical response I heard to my article was from Europeans. So I got a lot of Americans saying, yeah, I agree, I want to get out of here. I heard quite a lot of Europeans say, for God's sake, don't encourage them all to come here because they'll drive up prices and so on, which you can already see elements of, and particularly in Barcelona or in Venice. Admittedly, almost nobody lives in Venice except rich Americans now, but in Barcelona, where
are only rich Americans in Venice, no other rich people?
It has a particular appeal to
no Russians, no one from the Gulf.
There must be some. There are not many Venetians.
What about the historical context, Simon? In all seriousness, Americans have, of course, fled the United States in the past. One thinks of James Baldwin fleeing the Jim Crow South. Could the Americans now who are leaving the universities, Tim Schneider, for example, has already fled to Canada, as Jason Stanley has as well, another scholar of fascism. Is there stuff that American intellectuals, liberals, academics can bring to Europe that you guys currently don't have? Or are intellectuals coming to Europe from the US? Is it really like shipping coals, so to speak, to Newcastle?
We need them desperately. I mean, as you know, since 1933, there's been a brain drain of the best European intellectuals in enormous numbers to the United States. So in 1933, the best university system in the world was Germany, if you measure by number of Nobel Prizes won. That's demolished in a month. A lot of those people end up years later, especially in the US. And so you get the New School in New York as a center. And people like Adorno end up, I think, in Los Angeles, which must have been very confusing. And American universities, so you get the American combination, the USP, what's it called? The unique selling point is you have size, you have wealth, you have freedom of inquiry, which China doesn't have, and you have immigration. So you bring in the best brains. And so Europe lost its intellectuals. You have very wealthy universities, partly because of the role of donors in America. So, if you're a professor at Stanford or Columbia, I think the average salary is somewhere over $300,000 for professors at the top universities. In Europe, there's nothing like that. Those people would at least have to halve their salary. And so, for Europeans, this is a unique opportunity to get some of the world's leading brains back at cut price, because they would have to take a big salary cut, but many of them are desperate to do it. I mean, if your lab has been defunded by the government, or if the government doesn't believe in your research into climate or vaccines, or just if you're in the humanities and the government is very hostile to it, or if you write on the history of race, and that is illegal now in some southern states, where I think teaching, they call it structural racism, or there's this American phrase about racism that is now banned in some states, that the government won't fund it. Then you think, well, I'll take that pay cut and go back to Europe. Because I'm talking going back, I think the first people to take the offer are going to be the many, many top Europeans who work at American universities.
You mentioned at the end of your essay, the end of the American dream. You're quoting Trump, of course, ironically, but the essay is also about the end of the American dream, perhaps the rebirth or initial birth of the European dream. To what extent is the American dream, in your view, and you touched on this earlier, Simon, dependent on the great minds of Europe coming to America, particularly during and after as a response to the rise of Nazism, Hannah Arendt, for example, even people like Aldous Huxley, who came to Hollywood in the 1930s. Do you think that the American dream itself is in part dependent on European intellectuals like Arendt and Huxley, even Ayn Rand, who not necessarily the most popular figure on the left, but certainly very influential in her ideas about capitalism and freedom, who came, of course, from Russia?
I mean, I think the average American wouldn't care if Ayn Rand or Hannah Arendt had gone to Australia instead. That's not their dream. I think the American dream has always been about the idea of social mobility and building a wealthy life for yourself and your family from nothing. Now, almost all studies of social mobility say that it's now very low in the US. It's lower than in most of Europe, especially Northern Europe and Scandinavia have great social mobility. So if you're born in the lower, say 10 or 20% in Denmark, you have a much better chance of rising to the top of society than if you're born at the bottom 10, 20% in the US. So America is not very good for social mobility anymore. I think that the brains that helped the American economy most were people working in different forms of tech research, and especially for the federal government. So the biggest funder of science in the last 80 years or so, I mean, the Manhattan Project and on, has been the US federal government, biggest in the world. And the thing is, you can't eat atom bombs, but what they also produce is research that becomes hugely transformative in civilian life and in civilian industries. So GPS, or famously the internet, come out of research that's done within the federal government with a kind of vague defense angle. And so I think those are the brains that have made America richer. And then, of course, the number of immigrants who found companies, and you see this in tech, is much higher than the number of percentage of native-born Americans who do. And of course, the most famous example of that is Elon Musk.
Yeah, and you were on the show just before Christmas in response to your piece about Musk, Thiel, and the shadow of apartheid in South Africa. So I'm guessing you don't want the Musks and Thiels. They won't be welcome in Europe, will they?
I don't think they want to go. I mean, if you want to create a tech company, you want very deep capital markets. You want venture capital firms that are happy to bet, a few billion on you. And a very good place to do that, the best place in the world by far, is Silicon Valley. And so, a French friend of mine said he was at a reception in San Francisco, I think, surrounded by many, many top French engineers who all worked for Silicon Valley firms. And he thought, what would it take them to come back? He didn't have an answer. Now the answer might be maybe, well, Donald Trump could persuade them to leave. But they want to keep issuing visas for those kinds of people. I mean, the thing is that what we're seeing with Chinese breakthroughs in, what was it called? DeepSeek?
Yeah.
And also in overtaking Tesla on electric cars suggests that maybe, the cutting edge of innovation is moving from Silicon Valley after nearly 100 years to China. This is not my field of expertise at all. But, the French economist Thomas Philippon has written about how the American economy has become quite undynamic because it's been taken over by monopolies. So you can't start another Google, you can't start another Amazon, you can't build a rival to Facebook because these companies control of the market. And as Facebook did with WhatsApp or Instagram, they'll just buy you up. And so you get quite a much more static tech scene than 30 years ago, when really, great inventions were being made in Silicon Valley all the time. Now you get a few big companies that are the same for a very long period.
Well, of course, you also have OpenAI, which is a startup, but that's another conversation. Has the
although the argument in AI is that maybe China can do it better.
Perhaps they can.
I don't know.
Has, so to speak, Simon, the light bulb gone off in Europe on all these issues? Mario Draghi, month or two ago, came out. Was it a white paper or a report suggesting that Europe needed to get its innovation act together, that there wasn't enough investment or capital? Are senior people within the EU, like Draghi, waking up to the reality of this historical opportunity to seize back economic power, not just cultural and political?
I mean, Draghi doesn't have a post anymore, as far as I'm aware. I mean, of course, he was the brilliant governor of the European Central Bank, but he
But
wrote
that
this
report did have big
Yeah.
impact, didn't it?
It had big impacts. I think a lot of people thought, yeah, this is all true. We should spend enormous fortunes and borrow enormous fortunes to create a massive tech scene and build our own defense industries and so on. But they're not going to do it. It's the kind of report that you write when you don't have a position of power and you say, this is what we should do. And the people in positions of power say, oh, but it's really complicated to do it. So they don't do it. So no, there's not really, look, we've been massively overtaken and left behind on tech by the US and China. And there doesn't seem to be any serious impetus to build anything on that scale to invest that kind of money, government-led or private sector-led, in European tech scene. So yeah, if you're in tech, maybe you should be going to Shanghai, but you probably should not be going to Europe. So, and this is a problem because China and the US make our future, and we use their cloud servers. You know, we could build a search engine, but we can't liberate ourselves from the cloud servers. Defense is a different matter, where, you know, Draghi said we should become independent. And because European governments believe Trump is now hostile to us on defense, hostile to Ukraine and more broadly to Europe, there, I think, will be a very quick move to build a much bigger European defense sector, so we don't have to buy, for example, American planes, where they can switch off the operating systems if they feel like it.
You live in Paris. You work for the FT, or one of the papers you work for is the FT, a British paper. Where does Britain stand here? So many influential Brits, of course, went to America, particularly in the 20th century. Everyone from Alfred Hitchcock to Christopher Hitchens, all adding enormous value, like Arendt and Ayn Rand. Is Britain, when you talk of Europe, are you still in the back of your mind thinking of Britain, or is it an island somehow floating or stuck between America, the end of the American dream, and the beginning of the European dream? In a way, are you suggesting that Brits should come to Europe as well?
I think Britain is floating quite rapidly towards Europe, because in a world where you have three military superpowers that are quite predatory and are not interested in alliances, the US, China, and Russia, the smaller countries, and Britain is a smaller country and has realized since Brexit that it is a small country, the smaller countries just need to ally. And, you know, are you going to trust an alliance with Trump, a man who is not interested in the fates of other countries and breaks his word? Or would you rather have an alliance with the Europeans, who share far more of your values? And I think the Labour government in the UK has quietly decided that I know that it has decided that on economic issues, it's always going to prioritize aligning with Europe. For example, aligning food standards with Europe so that we can sell them our food, they can sell us our food without any checks because we've accepted all their standards, not with the US. So in any choice between, you know, now there's talk of a potential US-UK trade deal. Do we align our standards with the US or Europe? It's always going to be Europe first. And on defense, you know, you have two European defense powers that are at least middle powers, France and the UK. Without the UK, there isn't really a European defense alliance. And that is what is going to be needed now, because there's a big NATO summit in June where I think it's going to become patently obvious to everyone the US isn't really a member of NATO anymore. And so then you're going to move towards a post-US NATO. And if the UK is not in it, well, it looks very, very weak indeed. And if the UK is alone, that's quite a scary position to be in this world. So yeah, I see a UK that is not going to rejoin the European Union anytime soon, but is more and more going to ally itself. It's already allying itself with Europe.
Has the worm turned? I mean, Trump has only hasn't even been in power 100 days. Supposedly he's limited to the next 4 years, although he's talking about running for a third term. Can America reverse itself, in your view?
I think it will be very hard, whatever Trump does, for other countries to trust him again. And I also think that after Trump goes, which, as you say, may not be in 2028, but after he goes, and if you get, say, a Biden or Obama style president who flies to Europe and says, it's all over, we're friends again now, the Europeans are going to think, yeah, but, it's very, very likely that in 4 years' time, you'll be replaced by another America firster of some kind. So we cannot build a long-term alliance with the US. So, for example, we cannot do long-term deals to buy Americans weapon systems because maybe there's a president that we like, but they'll be succeeded by a president who terrifies us, quite likely. So there is now, it seems to me, instability built in for the very long term into America as a potential ally. You just can't rely on this anymore, even should Trump go.
You talk about Europe as one place, which of course geographically it is, but lots of observers have noted the existence, it goes without saying, of many Europes, particularly the difference between Eastern and Western Europe.
I've noted that myself, yes.
And you've probably written essays on this as well. Eastern Europe is Poland, perhaps, Czech Republic, even Hungary in an odd way. They're much more like the United States, much more interested perhaps in economic wealth than in the other metrics that you write about in your essay. Is there more than one Europe, Simon? And for Americans who are thinking of coming to Europe, should it be Warsaw, Prague, Paris, Madrid, Rome?
These are all great cities, so it depends what you like. I mean, I don't know if they're more individualistic societies. I would doubt that. All European countries, I think, could be described as social democracies. So there is a welfare state that provides people with health and education in a way that you don't quite have in the United States. And then the opposite, the taxes are higher, the opportunities to get extremely wealthy are lower here. I think the big difference is that there is a part of Europe for whom Russia is an existential threat, and that's especially Poland, the Baltics, Romania. And there's a part of Europe, France, Britain, Spain, for whom Russia is really quite a long way away. So they're not that bothered about it. They're not that interested in spending a lot on defense or sending troops potentially to die there because they see Russia as not their problem. I would see that as a big divide. In terms of wealth, I mean, it's equalizing. So the average Pole outside London is now, I think, as well off or better than the average Briton. Sorry, the average Pole is now as well off or better as the average Briton outside London. London, of course, is still...
This is the Poles in the UK or the Poles in the world?
The Poles in Poland. So the Poles who came to the UK 20 years ago did so because the UK was then much richer. That's now gone. And so a lot of Poles and even Romanians are returning because economic opportunities in Poland especially are just as good as in the West. So there has been a little bit of a growing together of the two halves of the continent. Where would you live? I mean, my personal experience, having spent a year in Madrid, it's the nicest city in the world. The Spanish quality of life. Yeah, nicest cities to live in. I like living in big cities. Of big cities, it's the best. Spanish quality of life. If you earn more than the average Spaniard, I think the average income, including everyone, wage earners, pensioners, students, is only about $20,000. So Spaniards have a problem with not having enough income. So if you're over about $20,000, and in Madrid probably quite a bit more than that, then it's a wonderful life. And I think, and Spaniards live about 5 years longer than Americans now. They live to about age 84. It's a lovely climate, lovely people. So that would be my personal top recommendation. But look, if you like a great city, Paris is the greatest city in the European Union. London's a great, kind of bustling. These are the two bustling world cities of Europe, London and Paris. I think if you can earn an American salary, maybe through working remotely, and live in the Mediterranean somewhere, you have the best deal in the world because Mediterranean prices are low, Mediterranean quality of life is unbeatable. So that would be my general recommendation.
Finally, Simon, you've been very generous with your time. I'm sure you'd much rather be outside in Paris, in what you call the greatest city in the EU. You talk in the piece about three metrics that show that It's time to move to Europe. Housing, education, longevity, happiness, and the environment. Are there any metrics at all now to stay in the United States?
I mean, if you look at people's incomes in the US, they're considerably higher. Of course, your purchasing power for a lot of things is less. So I think the big purchasing power advantage Americans have until the tariffs was consumer goods. So if you want to buy a great television set, it's better to do that out of an American income than out of a Spanish income. But if you want the purchasing power to send your kids to university, to get healthcare, then to be guaranteed a decent pension, then Europe is a better place. So even though you're earning more money in the US, you can't buy a lot of stuff. If you want to go to a nice restaurant and have a good meal, the value for money will be better in Europe. So I suppose if you want to be extremely wealthy and you have a good chance, a good shot at that, because a lot of people overestimate their chances of great wealth, then America is a better bet than Europe. Beyond that, I find it hard to right now adduce reasons. I mean, it's odd because, like the Brexiteers in the UK, Trump is attacking some of the things that really did make America great, such as this trading system that you can get very, very cheap goods in the United States, but also the great universities. So I would have been much more positive about the idea of America a year ago, but even then I would have said the average person lives better over here.
Well, there you have it. Simon Kuper says to Americans, it's time to move to Europe. The American dream has ended, perhaps the beginning of the European dream. Very provocative, Simon. We'll get you back on the show. Your column is always essential reading in the Financial Times. Thanks so much and enjoy Paris.
Thank you, Andrew. Enjoy San Francisco.